We'll start now. So let's get the official recording started. Okay, everybody, we are going to get started right now. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. Very excited to have you guys all on here today. We have a fascinating class for you today, all about slavery in America. And we're going to look at the Constitution, the founding of America, even the colonies, all the way to the Reconstruction time period in America. Now, to do that, that Reconstruction time period is right after the Civil War. But to do that well today, we have one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center, Nick Mosvick, is here with us today. And Nick, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, I'm Nick, and I am one of our senior fellows in constitutional content. And yeah, we should just get started. We don't have much time, right? So.
Yeah, so much to go over. We have a half an hour class. We're going to record it in live stream, like I said, so you can watch it again. But here's kind of the two big questions. And students, we're going to ask you this at the end and kind of see where you sit after class. So one big question is that, this is more of a statement. Slavery was embedded into America's fabric by the time of the ratification of the Constitution. So that means by the time we got and voted on keeping the Constitution. But do we all think that it affected how long slavery lasted in America and how it ended? That's a big idea we're going to go through today. Second big idea we're going to go through today is that during Reconstruction, at the end of the Civil War, we added 3 amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. These amendments ended slavery in America, and they tried to rebuild our nation and put stronger constitutional foundations into our document. But do we think that these amendments changed the Constitution so much that it's considered a second founding, just like Madison's time period? Is it a new birth of our country? There are some big ideas we want to get to, but there's so many good stories and so much sadness, but also so much heroic movement by Americans during these time periods. So let's jump in, Nick. And you're right, there is so much to go through. Do you want to start walking us through the Constitution and kind of where we see slavery in America in the Constitution?
I think we either start there or we kind of start with the bigger story that looms before the Constitution, whichever makes most sense. I think we usually start with the text, though. And so it's important here because there's a lot of places a text to look for, because as we'll talk about with the writing of the Constitution and the ratification process, that slavery itself, the reference to it was kept out of the Constitution, but there are pieces of text in it that appear to refer or likely refer or definitely refer to slavery. It depends, right? But we'll look through those texts. Curry's starting with the preamble, which we've talked about often, right? This is like sort of going back to the Declaration as well, right? Is to say is if we look at the basis for our founding documents and our founding concept of liberty. We'll talk about Frederick Douglass when we get towards the end, but Frederick Douglass looked at the preamble and just like the Declaration and thought and made clear that slavery was anathema or, working against these very core concepts, right? Justice, domestic tranquility, or you just pull out any of the language of the preamble, and to someone like Frederick Douglass, it was obvious that it shouldn't allow for the presence of slavery, right? So you start with the big ideas of liberty, but then we move to the other parts of the text of the Constitution. So the 3/5 clause is we will discuss how that was written into the Constitution, but this essentially had the effect of partially counting slaves in the South for purposes of representation, right? So if you think of the census or how representation is calculated, they were counted as part of the population and therefore allowed the South to get more representatives. So that was also important.
And it just, Nick, just to kind of pull out those words, because there's a lot of words here.
Yes.
They say it's 3/5 of all other persons. Yeah, so what Nick was saying a minute ago is they don't use the word slavery in here. They don't say enslaved people. They're putting it in here. Nick, why don't they use the word slavery or enslaved people in the original Constitution, that structural Constitution?
Yeah, so as I think we'll talk a little bit more about, this was Madison's famous words, that there shall be no property and man in the Constitution. So the idea was, the problem would be if slavery itself, if the word slave, if the word slavery, anything like that was put into the text of the Constitution, it would specifically protect the right to hold human beings. That was not only obviously in tension and against those founding ideals we just talked about, but the problem was that many of the founders, Madison including, were hoping that because slavery was a product of state law and nothing else, right? States decided whether or not slavery existed within their boundaries, that if it wasn't embedded into the Constitution's text, then there would be a possibility over time of getting rid of it, right? The hope was we can get rid of it in the future. Right now, in order to write a constitution, to have agreement, to have ratification, it's impossible to have abolition because the southern states won't accept it. And therefore we won't have a union. So it is the price of the union was some compromise. But the most important thing for Madison and others was to not compromise so much that slavery itself was written in the Constitution. So Curry pointed out in the 3/5 clause, you see 3/5 of all the persons. You also see that it refers to calculated number of whole free persons and those bound, and then including those bound to service for a term of years. That means indentured servitude. The point is there's obviously references here. What's the opposite of a free person? What's related to an indentured servant? You're kind of going down the line. People understood what that was referring to, right? And as we'll talk about, this language was actually known. It was pulled from another congressional act and actually an amendment and used in the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause, as we'll talk about, was not actually all that controversial during the writing of the Constitution. It was also taken from another text, the Northwest Ordinance, and it required Congress to act. So you'll see that it refers to fugitives, right? And persons held to service or labor. There's that terms again, right? No person held to service or labor. People would have understood what that meant. It's under state law, but they can be essentially reclaimed. But it requires Congress to pass a Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 in order to actually carry out this clause, right? So it did actually require congressional action. So those are some of the major pieces. The Slave Trade Clause is also another important piece of text. I think that comes up next. Yep, there it is. That's Article 1, Section 9. And essentially what this said was for 20 years, there's a moratorium on banning the Slave Trade Clause. And then right after that, Congress could ban the slave trade. They did immediately, January 1st, 1808. As soon as they could, they banned it. But this was also one of the biggest pieces of contention during the Constitutional Convention, right? So I said the Fugitive Slave Clause, they didn't really talk that much about that. But the 3/5 Clause and the Slave Trade Clause, those were particularly dramatic moments at the convention because the slave trade was controversial even for the Virginians who owned slaves themselves.
Got it. Now, we know that at the end of Reconstruction, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and we're going to dive into them in a minute. Do you want to talk about, before we were United States, what was going on in the colonies and slavery during this time period, to let everybody know, like, first of all, as you know, settlers from Europe come to America, they're not coming to a blank slate, and then how does slavery kind of play into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things to realize, of course, is that in 1607, 1609, you know, at the time of the founding of Jamestown, or you're talking about 1620 and you're going north to Plymouth Rock. Of course, Europeans had already been in the New World, the Spanish in particular, but also the Dutch and the French had already been exploring settlements. Spain had settled much of South America and Mexico, as well as parts of North America. And I mention that because the Spanish and the Portuguese had more or less created the Atlantic slave trade at the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century. So by the time the British arrived in the colonies, the Atlantic slave trade was in full existence, fully brutal existence. And so it was certainly already part of the New World. and certainly in places like Brazil, some of the island communities. And so it was in existence, and it didn't immediately take over. This is an important part of the British North American experience. Is initially the British relied primarily on indentured servitude. It was one of the ways to even get people to come to the New World. British didn't particularly want to. Most of the people initially came for money in search of treasure, essentially, or religious dissidents, but they weren't enough people to really establish a settlement. So bringing over indentured servants did that. Many of the first Africans to come to the colonies were indentured servants as well, because slavery itself, in terms of being a law, wasn't really established. So that took about until around the 1660s, in which colonies started to write legal codes that created these slave laws. And what was important about those slave laws is not only was it racialized in terms of targeting African slaves as opposed to indentured service or even Indians, which is important, right? Because Indians had been part of the slave trade and had also been taken as slaves themselves. But it was racialized and it was inherited, meaning that the children of slaves would also be slaves themselves.
And thank you for pointing that out, because I think that's you'll hear the word chattel slavery, and slavery, people say, well, slavery was around for thousands of years. It changes here. It becomes inherent to you're born into it. So if your mother is enslaved and you're born to that mother, you are then enslaved, correct?
Yes. Yes, and it is certainly true that in Native American experience and African experience, where of course slave trades existed for thousands of years, one of the things that made them different was what they called captive slavery, meaning that captives were taken as slaves, but they could become part of the family. They had a possibility of gaining freedom at some point. So the systems were different in some respects, and that's important because, again, it's not only that it's inherited, it's also written into a code.
Into the law.
Codification, of course, goes back to Hammurabi, but it is important here, and it is part of the change because by the beginning of the 18th century and throughout, the British participation in the slave trade and the amount of slaves in the colonies greatly increases. So that by the time of the revolution itself, it looks very different from what it did in a lot of the 17th century. So there's a significant change, and I think that's one important. We can throw out a couple of figures just because it's kind of helpful to have a bit of an idea of what this would have looked like. But just looking at Virginia, for instance, it went from 7% of the population of slaves to 28% in 1700 to 46% by 1750. So if you think we're talking about a period of 17 years going from 7% of the population to 46%. And similar, if not greater, things happen in places like South Carolina, which essentially was created by plantation owners in other British island colonies like Jamaica and I'm blanking. But in any case, that my point being is that South Carolina was even more intensely so. Lots of history goes into those economies and those particular experiences. But the point is, a lot of those colonies by the time of the Revolution, they look different. And of course, slavery did exist in the northern colonies as well. The characteristics of that is different though, because what historians call this is the difference between a society with slavery and a slave society. Meaning that in New York, many slaves would have worked in the city, would have worked on the docks, would have been rented out essentially. Urban slavery would have looked different. In South Carolina, where rice was grown, or tobacco in Virginia, the systems used were different and harsher, frankly. And that makes a difference because we say a society or a slave society, South Carolina was dominated by it, right? That was the economy, that was society. It was harder to say that about the North. And when you get to talking about this, this is why gradual emancipation really started with those northern colonies, right? Because it wasn't as embedded, right? It existed in many of the colonies, but it wasn't embedded the same way it was in the South. And that's going to be important when we talk about what happens at the Constitutional Convention, right? Why is it that South Carolina will not give in? Well, they're a slave society. They
Mhm.
say it outright. Their representatives say, well, if we give in, we have no economy, we have no society. So
And I
yeah.
think this is really important for the students to know, because so many times you say, why? Why is it like it here and not here? And it's not that, like, when we look at like racism around this, it's not that racism doesn't happen north to south, east to west, but when we're looking at why, and it's connected to the money and the economy, that's huge. Okay, so now you're going to fly us through to get to that point. Which is good, Nick. Like, so this question always, we get to the American Revolution and you say, how can we tell the world that all men are created equal and have a revolution, but then clearly not act that way? So we say one thing and we don't act another thing. So let's go through kind of the Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, and get us to the Constitution that you just walked us through, those key pieces that were in the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think the Declaration is maybe the important place to start, because one thing worth noting is that Thomas Jefferson himself wrote, is Kerry showing you right now, he wrote this large clause about the slave trade. And it specifically talked about, as you can see, this language: King George waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery into another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation. He's talking about the slave trade itself, all the death that happened in the literal trade itself. Jefferson's recognizing that. So why isn't this in the Declaration? Because you're going to read this and say, well, I didn't read this clause. I don't remember this from the Declaration, where he talks about the horrors of the slave trade and how it's offensive to liberty. Well, you know who objected to this particular clause? South Carolina did not want this clause in there, because, of course, Jefferson drafted it. There was a committee of 5, but then it was reviewed by Continental Congress, and those deep South colonies objected and said, no, we cannot have this in there. And so it didn't make it into the Declaration. But nonetheless, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the all men are created equal, well, that did have an effect. So I always like to talk about the immediate movement for abolition amongst Black colonists. Prince, I'm sorry, help me with this, Kara. I'm forgetting his name.
Prince Hall?
Prince Hall, yes, because I always want to say something else, and
I know what you're going to go to. Prince Hall is one of my favorite
but
stories,
Prince Hall,
so could share this one.
Yeah, he had done this before. He had petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to abolish slavery. Well, now he could point to the Declaration of Independence and quote from it at length and say, look, now that we have this declaration, we've started this struggle for liberty, shouldn't we abolish slavery and do it now? And Massachusetts didn't immediately do so, but they did so within 7 years. And they did so through their Supreme Court, and they pointed to the Declaration. So the Declaration did have an effect. So Pennsylvania here, 1780 is when they passed their gradual emancipation. Vermont acted in 1777 in their own constitution. So there's a real movement in those northern colonies that are inspired by this, because for a lot of revolutionaries, it does cause them to look internally and say, okay, there's a problem here, there's a tension here. Shouldn't this mean that we have to recognize freedom everywhere? And as I've noted, Black colonists immediately started a movement with these allies, these white allies, who also recognize this revolutionary rhetoric, to push for emancipation. That's how Ben Franklin ended his life as president of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, petitioning Congress in 1790 to abolish slavery. So it did inspire them, and it did inspire a real movement. So I think it's important to recognize that although it took a long time to really get that victory in the 1860s, it is not because people didn't hear those words and immediately think, well, we should get rid of slavery. I think people did.
My favorite story about Ben Franklin towards the end of his life, being so moved to say, I'm going to help with petitions to Congress to say we need to end slavery. He actually went to a school that was run by, in Philadelphia. They were all over and it was a school where African-American children and white children were all learning together, girls and boys. And he looked at all these kids learning and how brilliant they were. And that's what helped him go from being like, I don't, because he owned enslaved people during his lifetime. And that was the click that really helped him move forward, seeing just how brilliant kids were in our country. So
two Pennsylvanians who knew Quakers who got rid of their slaves were Ben Franklin and John Dickinson, right? We recognize them because they were convinced by the Quakers.
Yep. So one of the things that I just want to own about Pennsylvania, so gradual abolition, it did take a really long time to end enslaved people in Pennsylvania. I want to be honest about some of the moves that they made during this time period, start to begin to say, let's really value freedom for all people. But it was like something like 1850s that the last enslaved person is no longer in Pennsylvania, correct?
Yes, because gradual emancipation is also built on this idea of, property rights are inviolable, right? So we cannot completely destroy them. And if we just give all freedom right now, we'll completely destabilize society. We could have a breakup of the Union. We could have a civil war. There's all these fears of moving too quickly, right? And so it is true, Pennsylvania takes a while, though it's worth noting that one of the Supreme Court cases we talk about, Prigg versus Pennsylvania in 1842, comes out of their anti-slavery legislation in the 1820s that says you don't have to help with fugitive slaves, with the recapture of fugitive slaves in Pennsylvania. So there is those movements too, right? So there's gradual emancipation, there's actions like that. So there's a lot of things that happen because so much changes after the Constitution, and that fight continues, but it's different. It looks different.
Yeah, and I was going to say, so we get the Constitution. You walked us through those three clauses that kind of put slavery into the Constitution without naming it. And then, Nick, every time I read about this time period, it's like there's this wave towards freedom and then a pullback. And it kind of like all that kind of movement towards ending slavery kind of, I don't want to say halts, but it definitely slows down. What really causes that slowdown?
Yeah, and again, it's worth noting, of course, that there are people fighting for this. They never go away, right? It's important to recognize that there are both African American and white Americans who are fighting for this, especially religious reformers and dissidents who keep this fight going even when it ebbs and flows. But what happens, right? Well, a couple things happen, right? I talked about all this movement for gradual emancipation that takes flight in the North. And even Virginia changes its laws in the 1780s for a little bit to allow for some kinds of emancipation, right? It's limited, of course, but what changes? While the Haitian Revolution, Gabriel's Rebellion, this potential conspiracy to follow the Haitian Revolution and a slave uprising, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in 1822 in South Carolina, and then Nat Turner's Rebellion. I mention these events because for Southern societies in particular, even in Virginia, as I noted, where there's some movement to allow for more manumission and emancipation in the South and their laws, why do they turn back? Because of this fear that has lingered since really the start of the expansion of slavery over slave rebellion. And the idea that civil war and rebellion and bloodshed is coming and it must be prevented, right? And so I think it's very important to see to see that, right? That a lot of this comes from social fear, right? Fear of unrest. And so they do things as a result, right? They expand the internal slave trade, right? So I say, look, after 20 years, we get rid of the Atlantic slave trade. But what happens? There's an internal slave trade. So slaves are moved from Virginia in North Carolina in particular to the New South. That's Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, places like that. And so that's the answer of how we get to 4 million slaves in 1860. And they do things like denied reading and education, right? Because they blame those things for this creation. And then there's the offset, right? You're showing us all those abolitionists. Well, what changes there? Well, I mentioned this movement that's existing before, right? That movement's important because there are abolitionists early on. But what changes? Well, in 1829, a Black abolitionist named David Walker comes out and challenges white Christian society, essentially, to do something, to end slavery, not in the future, but immediately. And why does he do this? Because there was this movement for what was called colonization, which was, look, we should end slavery, but we should send all the former slaves back to an African colony. We can't all live together. We can't all be Americans. And Walker, in the immediate abolitionist, said, no, we need to end it now. We need to end it today. And we have to deal with the society we have. We have to figure it out. And William Lloyd Garrison and others were inspired by that. Garrison started the Liberator, really the first major abolitionist newspaper in 1831. And we saw Frederick Douglass. Well, Frederick Douglass was first a speaker for the Garrisonians. He later became really his own man because he wasn't really willing to listen to William Lloyd Garrison anymore. He didn't need him because Frederick Douglass was such an inspiring speaker and writer himself. Frankly, he didn't need the help. He started his own paper, he started his own organizations. But what was their turn, right, is we need to do this today. And Douglass got to the point where he said, not only do we need to do this, Garrison thought the Constitution was a covenant with death, that this was a pro-slavery document at its core. Douglass got to the point where he said, no, that's not true. What I think is the Constitution, the Declaration, the preamble, due process, property rights, all these things that are protected, they say slavery is wrong if we're honest about them. The text does not protect it. The problem with people is that they haven't lived up to their values. That's what Frederick Douglass said, right? No, we just need to live up to the founding documents and end slavery.
I love that. I love that because I mean, sometimes we still have those debates today. Like, is it a pro-slavery, anti-slavery document? So we can look back at those two and say, what did they think? And Frederick Douglass's autobiography, gang, I know we're going to assign homework all the time. It's really short. It's so good. He's an amazing writer. You will love it. And it's not a light read, but it's a short read.
Read the 1852 speech, the 4th of July, and read the 1860 speech on why the Constitution wasn't pro-slavery. He gave a lecture. He was in Scotland. Do you want to know why he's in Scotland? He had to flee after John Brown was captured and hanged. Because and
I will send you all. We had one of our actors at the Constitution Center read Frederick Douglass's speech. Yep. So I can send you that link too, so you can read it or look at it. I'll send you the link to the speech, and you can listen to her read it, and it's gorgeous. So I wanted to bring up Dred and Harriet Scott, and I'd like to tell a story from the perspective of Harriet Scott, since we never start with the women. But it was Harriet who first decided to take up this court case, correct?
Well, they both filed simultaneous freedom suits, are what they call. So this was the means by which African Americans could try to sue for their freedom, particularly if they had gone to or been brought to free territory, right? The idea was once you get out of slave territory and you go to a free state or free territory, because remember, under the Northwest Ordinance, there's no slavery in the territories that haven't yet become states. But then they could initiate something called a freedom suit. This is just a court action to recognize that freedom, right? So both filed suits. So they had their own lawsuits, right? So we do tend to think of Dred Scott, but Harriet had her own lawsuit as well. They both filed them in 1846. You're going to say, wait, I thought Dred Scott was 1857. Yes, it took 11 years to get there. This is a reminder that 19th century, 20th, 21st century, sometimes court cases take a long time. And it did here. It did here because it went to the state Supreme Court and then it got into the federal court through something we call diversity jurisdiction. We don't really need to explain to students too much about that, other than if citizens of different states sue, they can be in federal court. And in this case, eventually, Dred Scott was sued by a man in New York who was related to the widow of his former master, who worked for the Army as a surgeon, who had brought him to the Minnesota and Wisconsin territory, which were, again, they were free territories at the time. And so there was a suit. And so that brought it into the federal court, and that's how it eventually got to the Supreme Court in 1857. So that was Dred's particular case. And the point here, right, is if you look at how it got in the federal court, well, this man in New York had to claim Dred in particular is still his property essentially. And so that's how it got to the Supreme Court.
We have like 2 minutes left. So give us the outcome of the case, and then I want to walk through really quickly 13, 14, and 15. Yes. So we leave the students with those 3 amendments too.
And the outcome is really important because that's going to get us to those amendments, right? We need them. And yes, Kerry is showing you this famous passage from Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a Marylander. Taney wrote that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So Taney did 2 things in this case, right? One is he said African Americans can't be citizens. They're not recognized under any of the founding documents, whether it's the Declaration of the Constitution. That's what Taney said. And therefore, they couldn't sue in federal court. So that was the citizenship question. And then he also said the Missouri Compromise, which in 1820 was fashioned by Congress, and in particular, Henry Clay, which said for every new state, one will be slave, one will be free, and we'll have the 33-36 parallel to what we think of as the Mason-Dixon line to separate these slave states from the free states. Taney said that was unconstitutional. He said the federal government has no power to deal with the question of slavery at all, including in the territories, which was itself an incredible statement. So this meant that everyone had to respect the right to hold slaves anywhere in the Union, right? You have to think about how that would have been the consequences of that decision. And Taney and President Buchanan, James Buchanan at the time, thought that this would end the slavery question. We didn't really get to the politics of the 1850s, but this was the key question. This is what was pushing us to the point and brink of violence. Their hope was this would settle the question. It did not. The Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln, amongst others, said that this was wrong, right? The reason this is important, I know Kerry wants to make the transition, this is the transition though, right? Is that they were convinced that Dred Scott was wrong, was absolutely wrong. And so, of course, during the Civil War, we have emancipation itself, which is monumental in the turn towards freedom, because it grants freedom to 1.6 million African Americans at once. But of course, the permanent solution to that is the 13th Amendment, right? Which, of course, forever ends slavery or involuntary servitude. It is important to note, except for punishment for a crime. That's why convict duty is separate and still is, even today. But this, of course, gets rid of the 3/5 compromise. That no longer matters, right? That language that was in the Constitution that we talked about at the beginning, some of it now is null. It's a nullity. It doesn't matter anymore. And under Section 2, Congress has the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This is called an enforcement clause. There's one in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It's important because it represents the shift of power from the state governments, who, as I said, that's where slavery came from, right? Slave codes, slave laws were state. It shifts it to the federal government. Now the federal government will pass laws, will take action to protect the rights of people everywhere, right? Including from violations by states. So that's important.
So just to jump in here real quick. So Taney's statement is that no African American has any rights the white man needs to respect. So he even broadens that.
Yes.
The 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War begins this process of fixing that by saying neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except for punishment of crime. We're going to dive into that except for punishment of crime a lot next week. So I just wanted to just say what Nick said one more time. So, and one more thing on this, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The 13th Amendment did in name and in the Constitution.
Yes, without saying, without going deeply into it, it's important because it's a military order. It's an executive order from President Lincoln. So it affects slaves
the Emancipation
in Confederate territories. Yes. So it does give freedom to all slaves in Confederate territories, which is a lot. And it is significant because before their status was up in the air, even if they got to Union lines, even if they ran away. This says, no, they're forever free. But it doesn't affect the border states, and that's important. and it's still not in the Constitution. It's a military order. So Lincoln's fear was, look, right now during the Civil War, this has a huge effect. This is important. This grants freedom, but it's not permanent, because as soon as the war is over, I can't claim that power anymore. I did what I could under the Constitution, but we need an amendment because it needs to last forever. So that's why it was so crucial.
Yeah, so important. And sometimes Lincoln, he didn't want it, but he gets way too much credit. So let's 13th Amendment and slavery. 14th Amendment, Nick and I, because we're going to dive into this so much next week. A big idea of 14th Amendment. What does the 14th Amendment give people, especially African Americans at this time, but it's all people too? What does it give people?
I mean, the first important part, of course, is that Dred Scott's overruled, right? So this first sentence.
I am Dred Scott.
So, and essentially, Congress had already done so in the 1866 Civil Rights Act. We always mention that because it's important. It's done under the 13th Amendment. That essentially creates what we call birthright citizenship and these basic rights that are protected. But the fear was, it wasn't constitutionalized like the Emancipation Proclamation. We need to do this first, but then we need to make sure it's permanent, right? Which the only way to make it permanent is to have an amendment. So now it's in the Constitution. Dred Scott's gone. It's replaced by birthright citizenship. So all those born in the United States are citizens, right? Or subject to the jurisdiction thereof, right? That solves it. So Dred Scott's gone, right?
Awesome.
And then you've got your three core protections, right? You have due process, you have equal protection of the laws, and then you have privileges or immunities, right? States shall not make or enforce any laws that will abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. We'll talk about that more in part 2, but that has to do with protecting basic rights. Equal protection seems to be written for discrimination, to protect against discrimination. And of course, due process is sort of a rewriting of what existed already in the Fifth Amendment, but it's to apply it to the states, right? That's within there, right? It's the states now will be limited by all these things. And as we'll talk about the Bill of Rights in particular, but probably beyond that. And then of course, Section 5, as I mentioned, there's an enforcement clause, right? Is who has the power to enforce these rights that are created? Congress does. Congress decides, right? And we'll talk about this because it's important. The second part is how much power is that? That's a very important conversation, but it's there, right? And we see that. And 15th Amendment, that has that same enforcement provision. Basically, what this does is to say that the right to vote can't be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It's important to note that the text is written in the negative. It does not create a right to vote. Just like when we get to the 19th Amendment, it does not create a right to vote. It says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Here, you can't discriminate on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude, meaning the fact that you were a slave. Previously an enslaved person cannot be used against you. Again, though, it doesn't create broader voting rights. There were text versions of the 15th Amendment that did, versions that tried to limit poll taxes or other means of discrimination, since many of the Reconstruction Republicans knew that that was a possibility, that the South would try racist legislation in order to dilute the vote. But they ended up ultimately having to compromise on this, as I said, negative version of the language. And don't take negative the wrong way. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
It's not, it's describing the way the right is drawn, right? It doesn't create a positive right, meaning you have the right to vote. It says what you cannot do, right? So negative means government can't do this. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you guys use Grammarly, it would probably yell at you for the negative wording. So yes. It shall not. And I get that all the time. And it's like Grammarly doesn't like this. So Nick, that was awesome. It was so much to cover. So many people in this story. I think that's why it's my favorite topic to go through. You know, there's a lot of sadness and horror in slavery, but there's so many stories of people uplifting and fighting through it and moving our country forward. So thank you so much for walking us through this. Students, thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to have a great week diving into this fascinating and really interesting history. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Nick.